አድማጮቻችን ቡክ 4 አሁን ይቀጥላል ማለት ነው። ካርል ቫን ኦንዋር ቡክ 4 አሁን ይቀጥላል። መልካም ቆይታ። ዘውትር አዘጋጃችሁ አብራር ነኝ። መልካም ቆይታ።
Full gallop will in a few moments resume its proper order and the crisis ceases. A whole regiment of cavalry requires a longer time. It lasts still longer with infantry. If extended in single lines of skirmishers, and longer again with divisions of all three arms. When it happens by chance that one part has taken one direction and another part another direction, and the combat has therefore caused a loss of the order of formulation, which usually becomes still worse from not knowing exactly where the other is. Thus, therefore, the point of time when the conqueror has collected the instruments he has been using, and which are mixed up and partly out of order, the moment when he has in some measure rearranged them and put them in their proper places, and thus brought the battle workshop into a little order. This moment, we say, is always later, the greater the total force. Again, this moment comes later if night overtakes the conqueror in the crisis, and lastly it comes later still if the country is broken and thickly wooded. But with regard to these 2 points, we must observe that night is also a great means of protection, and it is only seldom that circumstances favour the expectation of a successful result from a night attack, as on March 10th, 1814, at Laon, where York against Marmont gives us an example completely in place here. In the same way, a wooded and broken country will afford protection against the reaction of those who are engaged in the long crisis of victory. Both, therefore, the night as well as the wooded and broken country, are obstacles which make the renewal of the same battle more difficult instead of facilitating it. Hitherto we have considered assistance arriving for the losing side as a mere increase of force, therefore as a reinforcement coming up directly from the rear, which is the most usual case, but the case is quite different if these fresh forces come upon the enemy in flank or rear. On the effect of flank or rear tactics so far as they belong to strategy, we shall speak in another place. Such a one as we have here in view, intended for the restoration of the combat, belongs chiefly to tactics, and is only mentioned because we are here speaking of tactical results. Our ideas, therefore, must stretch upon the province of tactics. By directing a force against the enemy's flank and rear, its efficiency may be much intensified, but this is so far from being a necessary result always, that the efficiency may, on the other hand, be just as much weakened. The circumstances under which the combat has taken place decide upon this part of the plan, as well as upon every other, without our being able to enter upon here. But at the same time, there are 2 things of importance for our subject. First, flank and rear attacks have, as a rule, a more favourable effect on the consequences of the decision than upon the decision itself. Now, as concerns the retrieving a battle, the first thing to be arrived at above all is a favourable decision, and not magnitude of success. In this view, one would therefore think that a force which comes to re-establish our combat is of less assistance if it falls upon the enemy in flank and rear, therefore separated from us, than if it joins itself to us directly. Certainly, cases are not wanting where it is so, but we must say that the majority are on the other side, and they are so on account of the second point, which is here important to us. This second point is the moral effect of the surprise, which, as a rule, a reinforcement coming up to re-establish combat has generally in its favour. Now, the effect of a surprise is always heightened if it takes place in the flank or rear, and an enemy completely engaged in the crisis of victory in his extended and scattered order is less in a state to counteract it. Who does not feel that an attack in flank or rear, which at the commencement of the battle, when forces are concentrated and prepared for such an event, would be of little importance, gains quite another weight in the last moment of the combat. We must therefore at once admit that in most cases a reinforcement coming up on the flank or rear of the enemy will be more efficacious, will be like the same weight at the end of a longer lever, and therefore that under these circumstances we may undertake to restore the battle with the same force which, employed in a direct attack, would be quite insufficient. Here, results almost defy calculation because the moral forces gain completely the ascendancy. This is, therefore, the right field for boldness and daring. The eye must, therefore, be directed on all these objects. All these moments of cooperating forces must be taken into consideration when we have to decide in doubtful cases whether or not it is still possible to restore a combat which has taken an unfavourable turn. If the combat is to be regarded as not yet ended, then the new contest which is opened by the arrival of assistance fuses into the former. Therefore they flow together into one common result, and the first disadvantage vanishes completely out of the calculation. But this is not the case if the combat was already decided. Then there are two results separate from each other. Now, if the assistance which arrives is only of a relative strength, that is, if it is not in itself alone a match for the enemy, then a favourable result is hardly to be expected from this second combat. But if it is so strong that it can undertake the second combat without regard to the first, then it may be able, by a favourable issue, to compensate or even overbalance the first combat, but never to make it disappear altogether from the account. At the Battle of Kunersdorf, Frederick the Great at the first onset carried the left of the Russian position, and took 70 pieces of artillery. At the end of the battle, both were lost again, and the whole result of the first combat was wiped out of the account. Had it been possible to stop at the first success, and to put off the second part of the battle to the coming day, then, even if the king had lost it, the advantages of the first would always have been a set-off to the second. But when a battle proceeding disadvantageously is arrested and turned before its conclusion, its minus result on our side not only disappears from the account, but also becomes the foundation of a greater victory. If, for instance, we picture to ourselves exactly the tactical course of the battle, we may easily see that until it is finally concluded, all successes in partial combats are only decisions in suspense, which by the capital decision may not only be destroyed but changed into the opposite. The more our forces have suffered, the more the enemy will have expended on his side. The greater, therefore, will be the crisis for the enemy, and the more the superiority of our fresh troops will tell. If now the total result turns in our favour, if we wrest from the enemy the field of battle and recover all the trophies again, then all the forces which he has sacrificed in obtaining them become sheer gain for us, and our former defeat becomes a stepping stone to a greater triumph. The most brilliant feats, which with victory the enemy would have so highly prized that the loss of forces which they cost would have been disregarded, leave nothing now behind but regret at the sacrifice entailed. Such is the alteration which the magic of victory and the curse of defeat produces in the specific weight of the same elements. Therefore, even if we are decidedly superior in strength, and are able to repay the enemy his victory by a greater still, it is always better to forestall the conclusion of a disadvantageous combat, if it is of proportionate importance, so as to turn its course rather than to deliver a second battle. Field Marshal Daun attempted in the year 1760 to come to the assistance of General Leyden at Liegnitz, whilst the battle lasted, but when he failed, he did not attack the king the next day, although he did not want for the means to do so. For these reasons, serious combats of advanced guards, which precede a battle, are to be looked upon only as necessary evils, and when not necessary, they are to be avoided. We have still another conclusion to examine. If, on a regular pitched battle, the decision has gone against one, this does not constitute a motive for determining on a new one. The determination for this new one must proceed from other relations. This conclusion, however, is opposed by a moral force, which we must take into account. It is the feeling of rage and revenge. From the oldest field marshal to the youngest drummer boy, this feeling is general, and therefore troops are never in better spirits for fighting than when they have to wipe out a stain. This is, however, only on the supposition that the beaten portion is not too great in proportion to the whole, because otherwise the above feeling is lost in that of powerlessness. There is therefore a very natural tendency to use this moral force to repair the disaster on the spot, and on that account chiefly to seek another battle if other circumstances permit. It then lies in the nature of the case that this second battle must be an offensive one. In the catalogue of battles of second-rate importance, there are many examples to be found of such retaliatory battles, but great battles have generally too many other determining causes to be brought on by this weaker motive. Such a feeling must undoubtedly have led the noble Blucher, with his Third Corps, to the field of battle on February the 14th, 1814, when the other two had been beaten 3 days before at Montmiral. Had he known that he would have come upon Bonaparte in person, then naturally preponderating reasons would have determined him to put off his revenge to another day, but he hoped to revenge himself on Marmont, and instead of gaining the reward of his desire for honourable satisfaction, he suffered the penalty for his erroneous calculation. On the duration of the combat and the movement of its decision depend the distances from each other at which those masses should be placed which are intended to fight in conjunction with each other. This disposition would be a tactical arrangement insofar as it relates to one and the same battle. It can, however, be regarded as such, provided the position of the troops is so compact that the two separate combats cannot be imagined, and consequently that the space which the whole occupies can be regarded strategically as a mere point. But in war, cases frequently occur where even those forces intended to fight in unison must be so far separated from each other that while their union for one common combat certainly remains the principal object, still the occurrence of separate combats remains possible. Such a disposition is, therefore, strategic. Dispositions of this kind are marches in separate masses and columns, the formation of advanced guards and flanking columns, also the grouping of reserves intended to serve as supports for more than one strategic point, the concentration of several corps from widely extended cantonments, and such and such. We can see that the necessity for these arrangements may constantly arise, and may consider them something like the small change in the strategic economy, whilst the capital battles, and all that rank with them, are the gold and silver pieces. Chapter 8. Mutual Understanding as to a Battle. No battle can take place unless by mutual consent, and in this idea, which constitutes the whole basis of a duel, is the root of a certain phraseology used by historical writers, which leads to many indefinite and false conceptions. According to the view of the writers to whom we refer, it has frequently happened that one commander has offered battle to the other, and the latter has not accepted it. But the battle is a very modified duel, and its foundation is not merely in the mutual wish to fight, that is, in consent, but in the objects which are bound up with the battle. These belong always to a greater whole, and that so much more, as even the whole war, considered as a combat unit, has political objectives and conditions which belong to a higher standpoint. The mere desire to conquer each other therefore falls into quite a subordinate relation, or rather it ceases completely to be anything of itself, and only becomes the nerve which conveys the impulse of action from the higher will. Amongst the ancients, and then again during the early period of standing armies, the expression that we had offered battle to the enemy in vain had more sense in it than it has now. By the ancients everything was constituted with a view to measuring each other's strength in the open field, free from anything in the nature of a hindrance, and the whole art of war consisted in the organisation and formation of the army, that is, in the order of battle. Now, as the armies regularly entrenched themselves in their camps, therefore the position in a camp was regarded as something unassailable, and a battle did not become possible until the enemy left his camp, and placed himself in a practicable country, as it were, entered the lists. If, therefore, we hear about Hannibal having offered battle to Fabius in vain, that tells us nothing more as regards the latter than that a battle was not part of his plan, and in itself neither proves the physical nor moral superiority of Hannibal. But with respect to him, the expression is still correct enough, in the sense that Hannibal really wished a battle. In the early period of modern armies, the relations were similar in great combats and battles, that is to say, great masses were brought into action, and managed throughout it by means of an order of battle, which, like a great helpless whole, required a more or less level plain, and was neither suited to attack, nor yet to defence in a broken, close, or even mountainous country. The defender, therefore, had here also, to some extent, the means of avoiding battle. These relations, although gradually becoming modified, continued until the First Silesian War, and it was not until the 7 Years' War that attacks on an enemy posted in a difficult country gradually became feasible and of ordinary occurrence. Ground did not certainly cease to be a principle of strength to those making use of its aid, but it was no longer a charmed circle which shut out the natural forces of war. During the past 30 years, war has perfected itself much more in this respect, and there is no longer anything which stands in the way of a general who is in earnest about a decision by means of battle. He can seek out his enemy and attack him. If he does not do so, he cannot take credit for having wished to fight, and the expression he offered a battle which his opponent did not accept therefore now means nothing more than that he did not find circumstances advantageous enough for a battle, an admission which the above expression does not suit, but which it only strives to throw a veil over. It is true the defensive side can no longer refuse a battle, yet he may still avoid it by giving up his position, and the role with which that position was connected. This is, however, half a victory for the offensive side, and an acknowledgment of his superiority for the present. This idea, in connection with the cartel of defiance, can therefore no longer be made use of, in order of such rhodomontade, to qualify the inaction of him whose part it is to advance, that is, the offensive. The defender, who, as long as he does not give way, must have the credit of willing the battle, may certainly say he has offered it if he is not attacked, if that is not understood of itself. But, on the other hand, he who now wishes to, and can retreat, cannot easily be forced to give battle. Now, as the advantages to the aggressor from this retreat are often not sufficient, and a substantial victory is a matter of urgent necessity for him, in that way the few means which there are to compel such an opponent also to give battle are often sought for, and applied with particular skill. The principal means for this are, first, surrounding the enemy so as to make his retreat impossible, or at least so difficult that it is better for him to accept battle, and secondly, surprising him. This last way, for which there was a motive formerly in the extreme difficulty of all movements, has become in modern times very inefficacious. From the pliability and manoeuvring capabilities of troops in the present day, one does not hesitate to commence a retreat, even in sight of the enemy, and only some special obstacles in the nature of the country can cause serious difficulties in the operation. As an example of this kind, the Battle of Neresheim may be given, fought by the Archduke Charles with Moreau in the Rhone Alp, August 11th, 1796, merely with a view to facilitate his retreat, although we freely confess we have never been able quite to understand the argument of the renowned general and author himself in this case. The Battle of Rossbach is another example, if we suppose the commander of the Allied army had not really the intention of attacking Frederick the Great. Of the Battle of Soor, the king himself says that it was only fought because a retreat in the presence of the enemy appeared to him a critical operation. At the same time, the king has also given other reasons for the battle. On the whole, regular night surprises excepted, such cases will always be of rare occurrence, and those in which an enemy is compelled to fight by being practically surrounded will happen mostly to a single corps only, like Mortimer's at Durenstein, 1809, and Van Dam at Kulm, 1813. Chapter 9. The Battle. Its Decision. What is a battle? A conflict of the main body, but not an unimportant one about a secondary object, not a mere attempt which is given up when we see betimes that our object is hardly within our reach. It is a conflict waged with all our forces for the attainment of a decisive victory. Minor objects may also be mixed up with the principal object, and it will take many different tones of colour from the circumstances out of which it originates, for a battle belongs also to a greater whole, of which it is only a part, but because the essence of war is conflict, and the battle is the conflict of the main armies, it is always to be regarded as the real centre of gravity of the war, and therefore its distinguishing character is that, unlike all other encounters, it is arranged for, and undertaken with the sole purpose of obtaining a decisive victory. This has an influence on the manner of its decision, on the effect of the victory contained in it, and determines the value which theory is to assign to it as a means to an end. On that account we make it the subject of our special consideration, and at this stage, before we enter upon the special ends which may be bound up with it, but which do not essentially alter its character, if it really deserves to be termed a battle. If a battle takes place principally on its own account, the elements of its decision must be contained in itself. In other words, victory must be striven for as long as a possibility or hope remains. It must not, therefore, be given up on account of secondary circumstances, but only and alone in the event of the forces appearing completely insufficient. Now, how is that precise moment to be described? If a certain artificial formation and cohesion of an army is the principal condition under which the bravery of the troops can gain a victory, as was the case during a great part of the period of the modern art of war, then the breaking up of this formation is the decision. A beaten wing, which is put out of joint, decides the fate of all that was connected with it. If, as was the case at another time, the essence of the defence consists in an intimate alliance of the army with the ground on which it fights, and its obstacles, so the army and position are only one, then the conquest of an essential point in this position is the decision. It is said that the key of the position is lost, it cannot therefore be defended any further, the battle cannot be continued. In both cases, the beaten armies are very much like the broken strings of an instrument which cannot do their work. That geometrical, as well as this geographical principle, which had a tendency to place an army in a state of crystallizing tension, which did not allow of the available powers being made use of up to the last man, have at least so far lost their influence that they no longer predominate. Armies are still led into battle in a certain order, but that order is no longer of decisive importance. Obstacles of ground are also still turned to account to strengthen a position, but they are no longer the only support. We attempted in the second chapter of this book to take a general view of the nature of the modern battle. According to our conception of it, the order of battle is only a disposition of the forces suitable to the convenient use of them, and the course of the battle a mutual slow wearing away of these forces upon one another, to see which will have soonest exhausted his adversary. The resolution, therefore, to give up the fight arises, in a battle more than in any other combat, from the relation of the fresh reserves remaining available, for only these still retain all their moral vigour, and the cinders of the battered, knocked-about battalions, already burnt out in the destroying element, must not be placed on a level with them. Also, lost ground, as we have elsewhere said, is a standard of lost moral force. It therefore comes also into account, but more as a sign of loss suffered than for the loss itself, and the number of fresh reserves is always the chief point to be looked at by both commanders. In general, an action inclines in one direction from the very commencement, but in a manner little observable. This direction is also frequently given in a very decided manner by the arrangements which have been made previously, and then it shows a want of discernment in that general who commences battle under these unfavourable circumstances without being aware of them. Even when this does not occur, it lies in the nature of things that the course of battle resembles rather a slow disturbance of equilibrium, which commences soon, but, as we have said, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with each moment of time becomes stronger and more visible than an oscillating to and fro, as those who are misled by mendacious descriptions usually suppose. But whether it happens that the balance is for a long time little disturbed, or that even after it has been lost on one side it rights itself again, and is then lost on the other side, it is certain at all events that in most instances the defeated general foresees his fate long before he retreats, and that cases in which some critical event acts with unexpected force upon the course of the whole have their existence mostly in the colouring with which everyone depicts his lost battle. We can only here appeal to the decision of unprejudiced men of experience who will, we are sure, assent to what we have said, and answer for us to such of our readers as do not know war from their own experience. To develop the necessity of this course from the nature of the thing, would lead us too far into the province of tactics, to which this branch of the subject belongs. We are here only concerned with its results. If we say that the defeated general foresees the unfavourable result, usually sometime before he makes up his mind to give up the battle, we admit that there are also instances to the contrary, because otherwise we should maintain a proposition contradictory to itself. If at the moment of each decisive tendency of battle it should be considered as lost, then also no further forces should be used to give it a turn, and consequently this decisive tendency could not precede the retreat by any length of time. Certainly there are instances of battles which, after having taken a decided turn to one side, have still ended in favour of the other, but they are rare, not usual. These exceptional cases, however, are reckoned upon by every general against whom fortune declares itself, and he must reckon upon them as long as there remains a possibility of a turn of fortune. He hopes by stronger efforts, by raising the remaining moral forces, by surpassing himself, or also by some fortunate chance, that the next moment will bring a change, and pursues this as far as his courage and his judgment can agree. We shall have something more to say on this subject, but before that we must show what are the signs of the scales turning. The result of the whole combat consists in the sum total of the results of all partial combats, but these results of separate combats are settled by different considerations. First, by the pure moral power in the mind of the leading officers. If a general of division has seen his battalions forced to succumb, it will have an influence on his demeanour and his reports, and these again will have an influence on the measures of the commander-in-chief. Therefore, even those unsuccessful, partial combats, which to all appearance are retrieved, are not lost in their results, and the impressions from them sum themselves up in the mind of the commander without much trouble, and even against his will. Secondly, by the quicker melting away of our troops, which can be easily estimated in the slow and relatively little tumultuary course of our battles. Third, by lost ground. All these things serve for the eye of the general as a compass to tell the course of the battle in which he is embarked. If whole batteries have been lost and none of the enemy's taken, if battalions have been overthrown by the enemy's cavalry, whilst those of the enemy everywhere present impenetrable masses, if the line of fire from his order of battle wavers involuntarily from one point to another, if fruitless efforts have been made to gain certain points, and the assaulting battalions each time been scattered by well-directed volleys of grape and case, if our artillery begins to reply feebly to that of the enemy, if the battalions under fire diminish unusually fast, because with the wounded crowds of unwounded men go to the rear, if single divisions have been cut off and made prisoners through the disruption of the plan of battle, if the line of retreat begins to be endangered, the commander may tell very well in which direction he is going with his battle. The longer this direction continues, the more decided it becomes, so much the more difficult will be the turning, so much the nearer the moment when he must give up the battle. We shall now make some observations on this moment. We have already said more than once that the final decision is ruled mostly by the relative number of fresh reserves remaining at the last. That commander who sees his adversary as decidedly superior to him in this respect makes up his mind to retreat. It is the characteristic of modern battles that all mischances and losses which take place in the course of the same can be retrieved by fresh forces, because the arrangement of the modern order of battle and the way in which troops are brought into action allow of their use almost generally, and in each position. So long, therefore, as that commander against whom the issue seems to declare itself still retains a superiority in reserve force, he will not give up the day. But from the moment that his reserves begin to become weaker than his enemies, the decision may be regarded as settled, and what he now does depends partly on special circumstances, partly on the degree of courage and perseverance which he personally possesses, and which may degenerate into foolish obstinacy. How a commander can attain to the power of estimating correctly the still remaining reserves on both sides is an affair of skilful practical genius, which does not in any way belong to this place. We keep ourselves to the result as it forms itself in his mind. But this conclusion is still not the moment of decision properly, for a motive which only arises gradually does not answer to that, but is only a general motive towards resolution, and the resolution itself requires still some special immediate causes. Of these, there are two chief ones which constantly recur, that is, the danger of retreat and the arrival of night. If the retreat, with every new step which the battle takes in its course, becomes constantly in greater danger, and if the reserves are so much diminished that they are no longer adequate to get breathing room, then there is nothing left but to submit to fate, and, by a well-conducted retreat to save what, by a longer delay ending in flight and disaster, would be lost. But night, as a rule, puts an end to all battles, because a night combat holds out no hope of advantage, except under particular circumstances, and as night is better suited for a retreat than the day, so therefore the commander who must look at the retreat as a thing inevitable, or as most probable, will prefer to make use of the night for his purpose. That there are, besides the above two usual and chief causes, yet many others also, which are less or more individual and not to be overlooked, is a matter of course. For the more a battle tends toward a complete upset of the equilibrium, the more sensible is the influence of each partial result in hastening the turn. Thus the loss of a battery, a successful charge of a couple of regiments of cavalry, may call into life the resolution to retreat already ripening. As a conclusion to this subject, we must dwell for a moment on the point at which the courage of the commander engages in a sort of conflict with his reason. If, on the one hand, the overbearing pride of a victorious conqueror, if the inflexible will of a naturally obstinate spirit, if the strenuous resistance of noble feelings will not yield the battlefield where they must leave their honour, yet, on the other hand, reason counsels not to give up everything, not to risk the last upon the game, but to retain as much over as is necessary for an orderly retreat. However highly we must esteem courage and firmness in war, and however little prospect there is of victory to him who cannot resolve to seek it by the exertion of all his power, still there is a point beyond which perseverance can only be termed desperate folly, and therefore can meet with no approbation from any critic. In the most celebrated of all battles, that of Belle Alliance, Bonaparte used his last reserve in an effort to retrieve a battle which was past being retrieved. He spent his last farthing, and then, as a beggar, abandoned both the battlefield and his crown. Chapter 10. Effects of Victory. Continuation. According to the point from which our view is taken, we may feel as much astonished at the extraordinary results of some great battles as to the want of results in others. We shall dwell for a moment on the nature of the effect of a great victory. Three things may easily be distinguished here: the effect upon the instrument itself, that is, upon the generals and their armies, the effect upon the states interested in the war, and the particular result of these effects as manifested in the subsequent course of the campaign. If we only think of the trifling difference which there usually is between victor and vanquished in killed, wounded, prisoners, and artillery lost on the field of battle itself, the consequences which are developed out of this insignificant point seem often quite incomprehensible, and yet, usually, everything only happens quite naturally. We have already said in the 7th chapter that the magnitude of a victory increases not merely in the same measure as the vanquished forces increase in number, but in a higher ratio. The moral effects resulting from the issue of a great battle are greater on the side of the conquered than on that of the conqueror. They lead to greater losses in physical force, which then in turn react on the moral element, and so they go on mutually supporting and intensifying each other. On this moral effect we must therefore lay special weight. It takes an opposite direction on the one side from that on the other. As it undermines the energies of the conquered, so it elevates the powers and energy of the conqueror. But its chief effect is upon the vanquished, because here it is the direct cause of fresh losses, and because it is homogeneous in nature with danger, with the fatigues, the hardships, and generally with all those embarrassing circumstances by which war is surrounded, therefore enters into league with them, and increases by their help. Whilst with the conqueror, all these things are like weights, which give a higher swing to his courage. It is therefore found that the vanquished sinks much further below the original line of equilibrium than the conqueror raises himself above it. On this account, if we speak of the effects of victory, we allude more particularly to those which manifest themselves in the army. If this effect is more powerful in an important combat than in a smaller one, so again it is much more powerful in a great battle than in a minor one. The great battle takes place for the sake of itself, for the sake of the victory which it is to give, and which is sought for with the utmost effort. Here, on this spot, in this very hour, to conquer the enemy is the purpose in which the plan of the war, with all its threads, converges, in which all distant hopes, all dim glimmerings of future meet. Fate steps in before us to give an answer to the bold question. This is the state of mental tension not only of the commander, but of his whole army, down to the lowest wagon driver, no doubt in decreasing strength, but also in decreasing importance. According to the nature of the thing, a great battle has never, at any time, been an unprepared, unexpected, blind, routine service, but a grand act, which, partly of itself, and partly from the aim of the commander, stands out from among the mass of ordinary efforts, sufficient to raise the tension of all minds to a higher degree. But the higher this tension with respect to the issue, the more powerful must be the effect of that issue. Again, the moral effect of victory in our battles is greater than it was in the earlier ones of modern military history. If the former are, as we have depicted them, a real struggle of forces to the utmost, then the sum total of all these forces, of the physical as well as the moral, must decide more than certain special dispositions or mere chance. A single fault committed may be repaired next time. From good fortune and chance we can hope for more favour on another occasion, but the sum total of moral and physical powers cannot be so quickly altered, and therefore what the award of a victory has decided appears of much greater importance for all futurity. Very probably of all concerned in battles, whether in or out of the army, very few have given a thought to this difference. But the course of a battle itself impresses on the minds of all present in it such a conviction, and the relation of this course in public documents, however much it may be coloured by twisting particular circumstances, shows also more or less to the world at large that the causes were more of a general than a particular nature. He who has not been present at the loss of a great battle will have difficulty in forming for himself a living or quite true idea of it, and the abstract notions of this or that small untoward affair will never come up to the perfect conception of a lost battle. Let us stop a moment at the picture. The first thing which overpowers the imagination, and we may indeed say also the understanding, is the diminution of the masses. Then the loss of ground, which takes place always, more or less, and therefore on the side of the assailant also, if he is not fortunate. Then the rupture of the original formation, the jumbling together of the troops, the risks of retreat, which, with few exceptions, may always be seen sometimes in a less, sometimes in a greater degree. Next the retreat, the most part of which commences at night, or, at least, goes on throughout the night. On this first march we must at once leave behind a number of men completely worn out and scattered about, often just the bravest, who have been foremost in the fight, who have held out the longest. The feeling of being conquered, which only sees the superior officers on the battlefield, now spreads through all ranks, even down to the common soldiers, aggravated by the horrible idea of being obliged to leave in the enemy's hands so many brave comrades, who but a moment since were of such value to us in the battle, and aggravated by a rising distrust of the chief, to whom, more or less, every subordinate attributes as a fault the fruitless efforts he has made. And this feeling of being conquered is no ideal picture over which one might become master. It is an evident truth that the enemy is superior to us, a truth of which the causes might have been so latent before that they were not to be discovered, but which, in the issue, comes out clear and palpable, or which was also perhaps before suspected, but which, in the want of any certainty, we had to oppose by the hope of chance, reliance on good fortune, providence, or a bold attitude. Now all this has proved insufficient, and the bitter truth meets us harsh and imperious. All these feelings are widely different from a panic. which in an army fortified by military virtue never, and in any other only exceptionally, follows the loss of a battle. They must arise even in the best of armies, and although long habituation to war and victory together, with great confidence in a commander, may modify them a little here and there, they are never entirely wanting in the first moment. They are not the pure consequences of lost trophies. They are usually lost at a later period, and the loss of them does not become generally known so quickly. They will therefore not fail to appear even when the scale turns in the slowest and most gradual manner, and they constitute that effect of a victory upon which we can always count in every case. We have already said that the number of trophies intensifies this effect. It is evident that an army in this condition, looked at as an instrument, is weakened. How can we expect that when reduced to such a degree that, as we said before, it finds new enemies in all the ordinary difficulties of making war, it will be able to recover by fresh efforts what has been lost? Before the battle, there was a real or assumed equilibrium between the two sides. This is lost, and therefore some external assistance is requisite to restore it. Every new effort without such external support can only lead to fresh losses. Thus, therefore, the most moderate victory of the chief army must tend to cause a constant sinking of the scale on the opponent's side, until new external circumstances bring about a change. If these are not near, if the conqueror is an eager opponent who, thirsting for glory, pursues great aims, then a first-rate commander, and in the beaten army a true military spirit, hardened by many campaigns, are required, in order to stop the swollen stream of prosperity from bursting all bounds, and to moderate its course by small but reiterated acts of resistance, until the force of victory has spent itself at the goal of its career. And now as to the effect of defeat beyond the army, upon the nation and government. It is the sudden collapse of hopes stretched to the utmost, the downfall of all self-reliance. In place of these extinct forces, fear, with its destructive properties of expansion, rushes into the vacuum left, and completes the prostration. It is a very real shock upon the nerves, which one of the two athletes receives from the electric spark of victory. And that effect, however different in degrees, is never completely wanting. Instead of everyone hastening with a spirit of determination to aid in repairing the disaster, everyone fears that his efforts will only be in vain, and stops, hesitating with himself, when he should rush forward, or, in despondency, he lets his arm drop, leaving everything to fate. The consequence which this effect of victory brings forth in the course of the war itself depend in part on the character and talent of the victorious general, but more on the circumstances from which the victory proceeds, and to which it leads. Without boldness and an enterprising spirit on the part of the leader, the most brilliant victory will lead to no great success, and its force exhausts itself all the sooner on circumstances if these offer a strong and stubborn opposition to it. How very different from Daun Frederick the Great would have used the victory at Cullen, and what different consequences France, in place of Prussia, might have given a battle of Leuthen. The conditions which allow us to expect great results from a great victory we shall learn when we come to the subjects with which they are connected. Then it will be possible to explain the disproportion which appears at first sight between the magnitude of the victory and its results, and which is only too readily attributed to a want of energy on the part of the conqueror. Here, where we have to do with the great battle in itself, we shall merely say that the effects now depicted never fail to attend a victory, that they mount up with the intensive strength of the victory, mount up more the whole strength of the army has been concentrated in it, the more the whole military power of the nation is contained in that army, and the state in that military power. But then the question may be asked, can theory accept this effect of victory as absolutely necessary? Must it not rather endeavour to find out counteracting means capable of neutralizing these effects? It seems quite natural to answer this question in the affirmative, but heaven defend us from taking that wrong course of most theorists, out of which is begotten a mutually devouring pro et contra. Certainly that effect is perfectly necessary, for it has its foundation in the nature of things, and it exists, even if we find a means to struggle against it. Just as the motion of a cannonball is always in the direction of the terrestrial, although when fired from east to west, part of the general velocity is destroyed by this opposite motion. All war supposes human weakness, and against that it is directed. Therefore, if hereafter in another place we examine what is to be done after the loss of a great battle, if we bring under review the resources which still remain, even in the most desperate cases, if we should express a belief in the possibility of retrieving all, even in such a case it must not be supposed we mean thereby that the effects of such a defeat can, by degrees, be completely wiped out, for the forces and means used to repair the disaster might have been applied to the realization of some positive object, and this applies both to the moral and physical forces. Another question is whether, through the loss of a great battle, forces are not perhaps roused into existence, which otherwise would never have come to life. This case is certainly conceivable, and it is what has actually occurred with many nations, but to produce this intensified reaction is beyond the province of military art, which can only take account of it where it might be assumed as a possibility. If there are cases in which the fruits of a victory appear rather of a destructive nature in consequence of the reaction of the forces which had the effect of rousing into activity, cases which certainly are very exceptional, then it must the more surely be granted that there is a difference in the effects which one and the same victory may produce according to the character of the people or state which has been conquered. End of Book 4, Chapter 10. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 4, Chapter 11 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Carl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 11. The Use of the Battle. Continue. Whatever form the conduct of war may take in particular cases, and whatever we may have to admit in the sequel as necessary respecting it, we have only to refer to the conception of war to be convinced of what follows. 1. The destruction of the enemy's military force is the leading principle of war, and for the whole chapter of positive action, the direct way to the object. 2. This destruction of the enemy's force must be principally effected by means of battle. 3. Only great and general battles can produce great results. 4. The results will be greatest when combats unite themselves in one great battle. 5. It is only in a great battle that the General-in-Chief commands in person, and it is in the nature of things that he should place more confidence in himself than in his subordinates. From these truths a double law follows, the parts of which mutually support each other, namely that the destruction of the enemy's military force is to be sought for principally by great battles and their results, and that the chief object of great battles must be the destruction of the enemy's military force. No doubt the annihilation principle is to be found more or less in other means. Granted, there are instances in which, through favourable circumstances in a minor combat, the destruction of the enemy's force has been disproportionately great, (Maxim), and on the other hand, in a battle, the taking or holding of a single post may be predominant in importance as an object, but as a general rule it remains a paramount truth that battles are only fought with a view to the destruction of the enemy's army, and that this destruction can only be effected by their means. The battle may therefore be regarded as war concentrated, as the centre of effort of the whole war or campaign. As the sun's rays unite in the focus of the concave mirror in a perfect image, and in the fullness of their heat, to the forces and circumstances of war unite in a focus in the great battle for one concentrated utmost effort. The very assemblage of forces in one great whole, which takes place more or less in all wars, indicates an intention to strike a decisive blow with this whole, either voluntarily as assailant or constrained by the opposite party as defender. When this great blow does not follow, then some modifying and retarding motives have attached themselves to the original motive of hostility, and have weakened, altered, or completely checked the movement. But also, even in this condition of mutual inaction, which has been the keynote in so many wars, The idea of a possible battle serves always for both parties as a point of direction, a distant focus in the construction of their plans. The more war is war in earnest, the more it is a venting of animosity and hostility, a mutual struggle to overpower, so much the more will all activities join deadly contest, and also the more prominent in importance becomes the battle. In general, when the object aimed at is of great and positive nature, one therefore in which the interests of the enemy are deeply concerned, the battle offers itself as the most natural means. It is therefore also the best, as we shall show more plainly hereafter, and as a rule, when it is evaded from aversion to the great decision, punishment follows. The positive object belonged to the offensive, and therefore the battle is also more particularly his means. But without examining the conception of offensive and defensive more minutely here, we must still observe that, even for the defender in most cases, there is no other effectual means with which to meet the exigencies of his situation, to solve the problems presented to him. The battle is the bloodiest way of solution. True, it is not merely reciprocal slaughter, and its effect is more a killing of the enemy's courage than of the enemy's soldiers, as we shall see more plainly in the next chapter, but still blood is always its price, and slaughter its character as well as name. From this, the humanity in the general's mind recoils with horror. But the soul of the man trembles still more at the thought of the decision to be given with one single blow. In one point of space and time, all action is here, pressed together. And at such a moment, there is stirred up within us a dim feeling, as if in this narrow space all our forces could not develop themselves and come into activity, as if we had already gained much by mere time, although this time owes us nothing at all. This is all mere illusion, but even as illusion, it is something, and the same weakness which seizes upon the man in every other momentous decision may well be felt more powerfully by the general when he must stake interests of such enormous weight upon one venture. Thus, then, statesmen and generals have at all times endeavoured to avoid the decisive battle, seeking either to attain their aim without it, or dropping that aim unperceived. Writers on history and theory have busied themselves to discover in some other feature in these campaigns not only an equivalent for the decision by battle which has been avoided, but even a higher art. In this way, in the present age, it came very near to this, that a battle in the economy of war was looked upon as an evil, rendered necessary through some error committed, a morbid paroxysm to which a regular, prudent system of war would never lead. Only those generals were to deserve laurels who knew how to carry on war without spilling blood, and the theory of war, a real business for Brahmins, was to be specially directed to teaching this. Contemporary history has destroyed this illusion, but no one can guarantee that it will not sooner or later reproduce itself, and lead those at the head of affairs to perversities which please man's weakness, and therefore have the greater affinity for his nature. Perhaps, by and by, Bonaparte's campaigns and battles will be looked upon as mere acts of barbarism and stupidity, and we shall once more turn with satisfaction and confidence to the dress sword of obsolete and musty institutions and forms. If theory gives a caution against this, then it renders a real service to those who listen to its warning voice. May we succeed in lending a hand to those who, in our dear native land, are called upon to speak with authority on these matters, that we may be their guide into this field of inquiry, and excite them to make a candid examination of the subject. Not only the conception of war, but experience, also leads us to look for a great decision only in a great battle. From time immemorial, only great victories have led to great successes on the offensive side in the absolute form. On the defensive side, in a manner more or less satisfactory. Even Bonaparte would not have seen the day of Ulm, unique in its kind, if he had shrunk from shedding blood. It is rather to be regarded as only a second crop from the victorious events in his preceding campaigns. It is not only bold, rash and presumptuous generals who have sought to complete their work by the great venture of a decisive battle, but also fortunate ones as well, and we may rest satisfied with the answer which they have thus given to this vast question. Let us not hear of generals who conquer without bloodshed. If a bloody slaughter is a horrible sight, then that is a ground for paying more respect to war, but not for making the sword we wear blunter and blunter by degrees from feelings of humanity, until someone steps in with one that is sharp and lops off the arm from our body. We look upon a great battle as a principal decision, but certainly not as the only one necessary for a war or a campaign. Instances of a great battle deciding a whole campaign have been frequent only in modern times. Those which have decided a whole war belong to a class of rare exceptions. A decision which is brought about by a great battle depends naturally not on the battle itself, that is, on the mass of combatants engaged in it, and on the intensity of the victory, but also on a number of other relations between the military forces opposed to each other and between the states to which these forces belong. But at the same time, the principal mass of the force available is brought to the great duel. A great decision is also brought on, the extent of which may perhaps be foreseen in many respects, though not in all, and which, although not the only one, still is the first decision, and as such has an influence on those which succeed. Therefore, a deliberately planned great battle, according to its relations, is more or less, but always in some degree, to be regarded as the leading means and central point of the whole system. The more a general takes to the field in the true spirit of war, as well as of every contest, with the feeling and the idea, that is, the conviction, that he must and will conquer, the more he will strive to throw every weight into the scale in the first battle, hope and strive to win everything by it. Bonaparte hardly ever entered upon a war without thinking of conquering his enemy at once in the first battle, and Frederick the Great, though in a more limited sphere and with interests of less magnitude at stake, thought the same when, at the head of a small army, he sought to disengage his rear from the Russians or the Federal Imperial Army. The decision which is given by the great battle depends, we have said, partly on the battle itself, that is, on the number of troops engaged, and partly on the magnitude of the success. How the general may increase its importance in respect to the first point is evident in itself, and we shall merely observe that according to the importance of the great battle, the number of cases which are decided along with it increases, and therefore generals who, confident in themselves, have been lovers of great decisions, have always managed to make use of the greater part of their troops in it, without neglecting on that account essential points elsewhere. As regards the consequences, or, speaking more correctly, the effectiveness of a victory, that depends chiefly on 4 points. 1. On the tactical form adopted as the order of battle. 2. On the nature of the country. 3. On the relative proportions of the 3 arms. 4. On the relative strength of the 2 armies. A battle with parallel fronts and without any action against a flank will seldom yield as great a success as one in which the defeated army has been turned or compelled to change front, more or less. In a broken or hilly country, the successes are likewise smaller because the power of the blow is everywhere less. If the cavalry of the vanquished is equal or superior to that of the victor, then the effects of the pursuit are diminished, and by that, great part of the results of victory are lost. Finally, it's easy to understand that if superior numbers are on the side of the conqueror, and he uses his advantage in that respect to turn the flank of his adversary, or compel him to change front, greater results will follow than if the conqueror had been weaker in numbers than the vanquished. The Battle of Leuthen may certainly be quoted as a practical refutation of this principle, but we beg permission for once to say what we otherwise do not like: no rule without an exception. In all these ways, therefore, the commander has the means of giving his battle a decisive character. Certainly he thus exposes himself to an increased amount of danger, but his whole line of action is subjected to that dynamic law of the moral world. There is then nothing in war which can be put in comparison with the great battle in point of importance, and the acme of strategic ability is displayed in the provision of means for this great event, in the skillful determination of place and time, and direction of troops, and it's the good use made of success. But it does not follow from the importance of these things that they must be of a very complicated and recondite nature. All is here rather simple. The art of combination by no means great, but there is great need of quickness in judging of circumstances, need of energy, steady resolution, a youthful spirit of enterprise, heroic qualities, to which we shall often have to refer. There is, therefore, but little wanted here of that which can be taught by books, and there is much that, if it can be taught at all, must come to the general through some other medium than the printer's type. The impulse towards a great battle, the voluntary sure progress to it, must proceed from a feeling of innate power and a clear sense of necessity. In other words, it must proceed from inborn courage and from perceptions sharpened by contact with the higher interests of life. Great examples are the best teachers, but it is certainly a misfortune if a cloud of theoretical prejudices comes between, for even the sunbeam is refracted and tinted by the clouds. To destroy such prejudices, which many a time rise and spread themselves like a miasma, is an imperative duty of theory, for the misbegotten offspring of human reason can also be, in turn, destroyed by pure reason. Chapter 12. Strategic Means of Utilizing Victory. The more difficult part, viz. that of perfectly preparing the victory, is a silent service of which the merit belongs to strategy, and yet for which it is hardly sufficiently commended. It appears brilliant and full of renown by turning to good account a victory gained. What may be the special object of a battle, how it is connected with the whole system of a war, whither the career of victory may lead according to the nature of circumstances, where its culminating point lies. All these are things which we shall not enter upon until hereafter. But under any conceivable circumstances, the fact holds good, that without a pursuit no victory can have a great effect, and that, however short the career of a victory may be, it must always lead beyond the first steps in pursuit. And in order to avoid the frequent repetition of this, we shall now dwell for a moment on this necessary supplement of victory in general. The pursuit of a beaten army commences at the moment that army, giving up the combat, leaves its position. All previous movements in one direction and another belong not to that, but to the progress of the battle itself. Usually victory at the moment here described, even if it is certain, is still as yet small and weak in its proportions, and would not rank as an event of any great positive advantage, if not completed by a pursuit on the first day. Then it is mostly, as we have before said, that the trophies which give substance to the victory begin to be gathered up. Of this pursuit we shall speak in the next place. Usually both sides come into action with their physical powers considerably deteriorated, for the movements immediately preceding have generally the character of very urgent circumstances. The efforts which the forging out of a great combat costs complete the exhaustion. From this it follows that the victorious party is very little less disorganized and out of his original formation than the vanquished, and therefore requires time to reform, to collect stragglers, and issue fresh ammunition to those who are without. All these things place the conqueror himself in the state of crisis, of which we have already spoken. If now the defeated force is only a detached portion of the enemy's army, or if it has otherwise to expect a considerable reinforcement, then the conqueror may easily run into the obvious danger of having to pay too dear for his victory, and this consideration, in such a case, very soon puts an end to pursuit, or at least restricts it materially. Even when a strong accession of force by the enemy is not to be feared, the conqueror finds in the above circumstances a powerful check to the vivacity of his pursuit. There is no reason to fear that the victory will be snatched away, but adverse combats are still possible, and may diminish the advantages which up to the present have been gained. Moreover, at this moment, the whole weight of all that is sensuous in an army, its wants and weaknesses, are dependent on the will of the commander. All the thousands under his command require rest and refreshment, and long to see a stop put to toil and danger for the present. Only a few, forming an exception, can see and feel beyond the present moment. It is only amongst this little number that there is sufficient mental vigour to think, after what is absolutely necessary at the moment has been done, upon those results which, at such a moment, only appear to the rest as mere embellishments of victory, as a luxury of triumph. But all these thousands have a voice in the council of the general, for through the various steps of the military hierarchy, these interests of the sensuous creature have their sure conductor into the heart of the commander. He himself, through mental and bodily fatigue, is more or less weakened in his natural activity, and thus it happens then that, mostly from these causes, purely incidental to human nature, less is done than might have been done, and that generally what is done is to be ascribed entirely to the thirst for glory, the energy indeed, also the hard-heartedness of the general-in-chief. It is only thus we can explain the hesitating manner in which many generals follow up a victory which superior numbers have given them. The first pursuit of the enemy we limit in general to the extent of the first day, including the night following the victory. At the end of that period, the necessity of rest ourselves prescribes a halt in any case. This first pursuit has different natural degrees. The first is if cavalry alone are employed. In that case, it amounts usually more to alarming and watching than to pressing the enemy in reality, because the smallest obstacle of ground is generally sufficient to check the pursuit. Useful as cavalry may be against single bodies of broken, demoralized troops, still, when opposed to the bulk of the beaten army, it becomes again only the auxiliary arm, because the troops in retreat can employ fresh reserves to cover the movement, and therefore, at the next trifling obstacle of ground, by combining all arms, they can make a stand with success. The only exception to this is in the case of an army in actual flight, in a complete state of dissolution. The second degree is, if the pursuit is made by a strong advance guard composed of all arms, the greater part consisting naturally of cavalry. Such a pursuit generally drives the enemy as far as the nearest strong position for his rear guard, or the next position affording space for his army. Neither can usually be found at once, and therefore the pursuit can be carried further. Generally, however, it does not extend beyond the distance of one, or at most a couple of leagues, because otherwise the advance guard would not feel itself sufficiently supported. The third and most vigorous degree is when the victorious army itself continues to advance as far as its physical powers can endure. In this case, the beaten army will generally quit such ordinary positions as a country usually offers on the mere show of an attack, or of an intention to turn its flank, and then the rear guard will be still less likely to engage in an obstinate resistance. In all three cases, the night, if it sets in before the conclusion of the whole act, usually puts an end to it, and the few instances in which this has not taken place and the pursuit has been continued throughout the night must be regarded as pursuits in an exceptionally vigorous form. If we reflect that in fighting by night everything must be more or less abandoned to chance, and that at the conclusion of a battle the regular cohesion and order of things in an army must inevitably be disturbed, we may easily conceive the reluctance of both generals to carry on their business under such disadvantageous conditions. If a complete dissolution of the vanquished army, or a rare superiority of the victorious army in military virtue, does not ensure success, everything would be in a manner given up to fate, which can never be for the interest of anyone, even of the most foolhardy general. As a rule, therefore, night puts an end to pursuit, even when the battle has only been decided shortly before darkness sets in. This allows the conquered either time for rest and to rally immediately, or, if he retreats during the night, it gives him a march in advance. After this break, the conquered is decidedly in a better condition. Much of that which had been thrown into confusion has been brought again into order. Ammunition has been renewed. The whole has been put in a fresh formation. Whatever further encounter now takes place with the enemy is a new battle, not a continuation of the old, and although it may be far from promising absolute success, still it is a fresh combat and not merely a gathering up of the debris by the victor. When, therefore, the conqueror can continue the pursuit itself throughout the night, if only with a strong advance guard composed of all arms of the service, the effect of the victory is immensely increased. Of this the battles of Leuthen and La Belle Alliance are examples. The whole action of this pursuit is mainly tactical, and we only dwell upon it here in order to make plain the difference, which, through it, may be produced in the effect of a victory. This first pursuit, as far as the nearest stopping point, belongs as a right to every conqueror, and is hardly in any way connected with his further plans and combinations. These may considerably diminish the positive results of a victory gained with the main body of the army, but they cannot make the first use of it impossible. At least cases of this kind, if conceivable at all, must be so uncommon that they should have no appreciable influence on theory. And here certainly we must say that the example afforded by modern wars opens up quite a new field for energy. In preceding wars, resting on a narrower basis and altogether more circumscribed in their scope, there were many unnecessary conventional restrictions in various ways, but particularly in this point. The conception, honour of victory, seems to generals so much by far the chief thing that they thought the less of the complete destruction of the enemy's military force, as in point of fact that destruction of force appeared to them only as one of the many means in war, not by any means as the principal, much less as the only means, so that they more readily put the sword into the sheath the moment the enemy had lowered his. Nothing seemed more natural to them than to stop the combat as soon as the decision was obtained, and to regard all further carnage as unnecessary cruelty. Even if this false philosophy did not determine their resolutions entirely, still it was a point of view which, by representations of the exhaustion of all powers and physical impossibility of continuing the struggle, obtained readier evidence and greater weight. Certainly the sparing of one's own instrument of victory is a vital question, if we only possess this one, and foresee that soon the time may arrive when it will not be sufficient for all that remains to be done, for every continuation of the offensive must lead, ultimately, to complete exhaustion. But this calculation was still so far false as the further loss of forces by a continuance of the pursuit could bear no proportion to that which the enemy must suffer. That view, therefore, again, could only exist because the military forces were not considered the vital factor. And so we find that in former wars, real heroes only, such as Charles XII, Marlborough, Eugene, Frederick the Great, added a vigorous pursuit to their victories when they were decisive enough, and that other generals usually contented themselves with the possession of the field of battle. In modern times, the greater energy infused into the conduct of wars, through the greater importance of the circumstances from which they have proceeded, has thrown down these conventional barriers. The pursuit has become an all-important business for the conqueror. Trophies have, on that account, multiplied in extent, and if there are cases also in modern warfare in which this has not been the case, still they belong to the list of exceptions, and are to be accounted for by peculiar circumstances. At Gorschen and Bautzen, nothing but the superiority of the Allied cavalry prevented a complete rout. At Grossbeeren and Dennewitz, the ill wind of Bernadotte, the Crown Prince of Sweden. At Laon, the enfeebled personal condition of Blücher, who was then 70 years old and, at the moment, confined to a dark room owing to an injury of his eyes. But Borodino is also an illustration to the point here, and we cannot resist saying a few more words about it, partly because we do not consider the circumstances are explained simply by attaching blame to Bonaparte, partly because it might appear as if this, and with it a great number of similar cases, belonged to that class which we have designated as so extremely rare, cases in which the general relations seize and fetter the general at the very beginning of the battle. French authors in particular, and great admirers of Bonaparte, Vaudancourt, Chambray, Ségur, have blamed him decidedly because he did not drive the Russian army completely off the field and use his last reserves to scatter it, because then what was only a lost battle would have been a complete rout. We should be obliged to diverge too far to describe circumstantially the mutual situation of the two armies, but this much is evident, that when Bonaparte passed the Niemen with his army, the same corps, which afterwards fought at Borodino, numbered 300,000 men, of whom now only 120,000 remained. He might therefore well be apprehensive that he would not have enough left to march upon Moscow, the point on which everything seemed to depend. The victory which he had just gained gave him nearly a certainty of taking that capital. for that the Russians would be in a condition to fight a second battle within 8 days seemed in the highest degree improbable, and in Moscow he hoped to find peace. No doubt the complete dispersion of the Russian army would have made this peace much more certain, but still the first consideration was to get to Moscow. That is, to get there with a force with which he should appear dictator over the capital, and through that over the empire and the government. The force which he brought with him to Moscow was no longer sufficient for that, as shown in the sequel, but it would have been still less so if, in scattering the Russian army, he had scattered his own at the same time. Bonaparte was thoroughly alive to this, and in our eyes he stands completely justified. But on that account this case is still not to be reckoned amongst those in which, through the general relations, the general is interdicted from following up his victory. For there never was in his case any question of mere pursuit. The victory was decided at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the Russians still occupied the greater part of the field of battle. They were not yet disposed to give up the ground, and if the attack had been renewed, they would still have offered a most determined resistance, which would undoubtedly have ended in their complete defeat, but which would have cost the conqueror much further bloodshed. We must therefore reckon the Battle of Borodino as amongst battles like Bautzen, left unfinished. At Bautzen, the vanquished preferred to quit the field sooner. At Borodino, the conqueror preferred to content himself with a half-victory, not because the decision appeared doubtful, but because he was not rich enough to pay for the whole. Returning now to our subject, the deduction from our reflections in relation to the first stage of the pursuit is that the energy thrown into it chiefly determines the value of the victory. That this pursuit is a second act of the victory, in many cases more important also than the first, and that strategy, whilst here approaching tactics to receive from it the harvest of success, exercises the first act of her authority by demanding this completion of the victory. But further, the effects of victory are very seldom found to stop with this first pursuit. Now first begins the real career to which the victory lent velocity. This course is conditioned, as we have already said, by other relations of which it is not yet time to speak, but we must here mention what there is of a general character in the pursuit in order to avoid repetition when the subject occurs again. In the further stages of pursuit, again, we can distinguish 3 degrees: the simple pursuit, a hard pursuit, and a parallel march to intercept. The simple following or pursuing causes the enemy to continue his retreat until he thinks he can risk another battle. It will, therefore, in its effect, suffice to exhaust the advantages gained, and besides that, all that the enemy cannot carry with him, sick, wounded, and disabled from fatigue, quantities of baggage, and carriages of all kinds, will fall into our hands. But this mere following does not tend to heighten the disorder in the enemy's army, an effect which is produced by the 2 following causes. If, for instance, instead of contenting ourselves with taking up every day the camp the enemy has just vacated, occupying just as much of the country as he chooses to abandon, we make our own arrangements so as every day to encroach further, and accordingly, with our advance guard organized for the purpose, attack his rear guard every time it attempts to halt, then such a course will hasten his retreat, and consequently tend to increase his disorganization. This it will principally effect by the character of continuous flight, which his retreat will thus assume. Nothing has such a depressing influence on the soldier as the sound of the enemy's cannon afresh at the moment when, after a forced march, he seeks some rest. If this excitement is continued from day to day for some time, it may lead to a complete rout. There lies in it a constant admission of being obliged to obey the law of the enemy, and of being unfit for any resistance, and the consciousness of this cannot do otherwise than weaken the moral of an army in a high degree. The effect of pressing the enemy in this way attains a maximum when it drives the enemy to make night marches. If the conqueror scares away the discomfited opponent at sunset from a camp which has just been taken up, either for the main body of the army or for the rear guard, the conquered must either make a night march or alter his position in the night, retreating further away, which is much the same thing. The victorious party can, on the other hand, pass the night in quiet. The arrangement of marches and the choice of positions depend in this case also upon many other things, especially on the supply of the army, on strong natural obstacles in the country, on large towns, and such, that it would be ridiculous pedantry to attempt to show by a geometrical analysis how the pursuer, being able to impose his laws on the retreating enemy, can compel him to march at night while he takes his rest, but nevertheless it is true and practicable that marches in pursuit may be so planned as to have this tendency, and that the efficacy of the pursuit is very much enhanced thereby. If this is seldom attended to in the execution, it is because such a procedure is more difficult for the pursuing army than a regular adherence to ordinary marches in the daytime. To start in good time in the morning, to encamp at midday, to occupy the rest of the day in providing for the ordinary wants of the army, and to use the night for repose, is a much more convenient method than to regulate one's movements exactly according to those of the enemy, therefore to determine nothing till the last moment, to start on the march, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, to be always for several hours in the presence of the enemy, and exchanging cannon shots with him, and keeping up skirmishing fire, to plan manoeuvres to turn him, in short, to make the whole outlay of tactical means which such a course renders necessary. All that naturally bears with a heavy weight on the pursuing army, and in war, where there are so many burdens to be borne, men are always inclined to strip off those which do not seem absolutely necessary. These observations are true, whether applied to a whole army, or, as in the more usual case, to a strong advance guard. For the reasons just mentioned, this second method of pursuit, this continued pressing of the enemy pursued, is rather a rare occurrence. Even Bonaparte, in his Russian campaign, 1812, practiced it but little, for the reasons here apparent, that the difficulties and hardships of this campaign already threatened his army with destruction before it could reach its object. On the other hand, the French in their other campaigns have distinguished themselves by their energy in this point also. Lastly, the third and most effectual form of pursuit is the parallel march to the immediate object of the retreat. Every defeated army will naturally have behind it, at a greater or less distance, some point, the attainment of which is the first purpose in view, whether it be that, failing in this, its further retreat might be compromised, as in the case of a defile, or that it is important for the point itself to reach it before the enemy, as in the case of a great city, magazines, and such, or lastly that the army at this point will gain new powers of defence, such as a strong position or junction with other corps. Now, if the conqueror directs his march on this point by a lateral road, it is evident how that may quicken the retreat of the beaten army in a destructive manner, convert it into hurry, perhaps into flight. The conquered has only 3 ways to counteract this. The first is to throw himself in front of the enemy, in order, by an unexpected attack, to gain that probability of success, which is lost to him in general from his position. This plainly supposes an enterprising, bold general, and an excellent army, beaten but not utterly defeated. Therefore it can only be employed by a beaten army in very few cases. The second way is hastening the retreat, but this is just what the conqueror wants, and it easily leads to immoderate efforts on the part of the troops, by which enormous losses are sustained in stragglers, broken guns, and carriages of all kinds. The third way is to make a detour, and get round the nearest point of interception, to march with more ease at a greater distance from the enemy, and thus to render the haste required less damaging. This last way is the worst of all. It generally turns out like a new debt contracted by an insolvent debtor, and leads to greater embarrassment. There are cases in which this course is advisable, others where there is nothing else left, also instances in which it has been successful, but upon the whole it is certainly true that its adoption is usually influenced less by a clear persuasion of its being the surest way of attaining the aim than by another inadmissible motive. This motive is the dread of encountering the enemy. Woe to the commander who gives in to this! However much the moral of his army may have deteriorated, and however well-founded may be his apprehension of being at a disadvantage in any conflict with the enemy, the evil will only be made worse by too anxiously avoiding every possible risk of collision. Bonaparte in 1813 would never have brought over the Rhine with him the 30 or 40,000 men who remained after the Battle of Hanau, if he had avoided that battle and tried to pass the Rhine at Mannheim or Koblenz. It is just by means of small combats, carefully prepared and executed, and in which the defeated army being on the defensive has always the assistance of the ground, it is just by these that the moral strength of the army can first be resuscitated. The beneficial effect of the smallest successes is incredible, but with most generals the adoption of this plan implies great self-command. The other way, that of evading all encounter, appears at first so much easier that there is a natural preference for its adoption. It is therefore usually just this system of evasion which best promotes the view of the pursuer, and often ends with the complete downfall of the pursued. We must, however, recollect here that we are speaking of a whole army, not of a single division, which, having been cut off, is seeking to join the main army by making a detour. In such a case circumstances are different, and success is not uncommon, but there is one condition requisite to the success of this race of two corps for an object, which is that the division of the pursuing army should follow by the same road which the pursuit has taken, in order to pick up stragglers, and keep up the impression which the presence of the enemy never fails to make. Blücher neglected to do this in his, in other respects unexceptionable, pursuit after La Belle Alliance. Such marches tell upon the pursuer as well as the pursued, and they are not advisable if the enemy's army rallies itself upon another considerable one, if it has a distinguished general at its head, and if its destruction is not already well prepared. But when this means can be adopted, it acts also like a great mechanical power. The losses of the beaten army from sickness and fatigue are on such a disproportionate scale. The spirit of the army is so weakened and lowered by the constant solicitude about impending ruin, that at last anything like a well-organized stand is well out of the question. Every day thousands of prisoners fall into the enemy's hands without striking a blow. In such a season of complete good fortune, the conqueror need not hesitate about dividing his forces in order to draw into the vortex of destruction everything within the reach of his army, to cut off detachments, to take fortresses unprepared for defence, to occupy large towns, and such and such. He may do anything until a new state of things arises, and the more he ventures in this way, the longer will it be before that change will take place. There is no want of examples of brilliant results from grand decisive victories, and of great and vigorous pursuits in the wars of Bonaparte. We need only quote Jena, 1806, Ratisbonne, 1809, Leipzig, 1813, and Belle Alliance, 1815. End of Book 4, Chapter 12. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 4, Chapter 13 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Book 4, Chapter 13. Retreat after a lost battle. In a lost battle, the power of an army is broken, the moral to a greater degree than the physical. A second battle, unless fresh favourable circumstances come into play, would lead to a complete defeat, perhaps to destruction. This is a military axiom. According to the usual course, the retreat is continued up to that point where the equilibrium of forces is restored, either by reinforcements, or by the protection of strong fortresses, or by great defensive positions afforded by the country, or by a separation of the enemy's force. The magnitude of the losses sustained, the extent of the defeat, but still more the character of the enemy, will bring nearer or put off the instant of this equilibrium. How many instances may be found of a beaten army rallied again at a short distance, without its circumstances having altered in any way since the battle? The cause of this may be traced to the moral weakness of the adversary, or to the preponderance gained in the battle not having been sufficient to make lasting impression. To profit by this weakness, or mistake, of the enemy, not to yield 1 inch breadth more than the pressure of circumstance demands, but, above all things, in order to keep up the moral forces to as advantageous a point as possible, a slow retreat, offering incessant resistance, and bold courageous counterstrokes, whenever the enemy seeks to gain any excessive advantages, are absolutely necessary. Retreats of great generals and of armies inured to war have always resembled the retreat of a wounded lion. Such is, undoubtedly, also the best theory. It is true that at the moment of quitting a dangerous position, we have often seen trifling formalities observed which caused a waste of time and were therefore attended with danger, whilst in such cases everything depends on getting out of the place speedily. Practised generals reckon this maxim a very important one. But such cases must not be confounded with a general retreat after a lost battle. Whoever then thinks by a few rapid marches to gain a start, and more easily to recover a firm standing, commits a great error. The first movements should be as small as possible, and it is a maxim in general not to suffer ourselves to be dictated to by the enemy. This maxim cannot be followed without bloody fighting with the enemy at our heels, but the gain is worth the sacrifice. Without it, we get into an accelerated pace, which soon turns into a headlong rush, and costs merely in stragglers more men than rearguard combats, and besides that extinguishes the last remnants of the spirit of resistance. A strong rearguard composed of picked troops, commanded by the bravest general and supported by the whole army at critical moments, a careful utilization of ground, strong ambuscades, wherever the boldness of the enemy's advance guard and the ground afford opportunity, in short, the preparation and system of regular small battles, these are the means of following this principle. The difficulties of a retreat are naturally greater or less according as the battle has been fought under more or less favourable circumstances, and according as it has been more or less obstinately contested. The Battle of Jena and La Belle Alliance show how impossible anything like a regular retreat may become if the last man is used up against a powerful enemy. Now and again it has been suggested to divide for the purpose of retreating, therefore to retreat in separate divisions, or even eccentrically. Such a separation as is made merely for convenience, and along with which concentrated action continues possible, and is kept in view, is not what we now refer to. Any other kind is extremely dangerous, contrary to the nature of the thing, and therefore a great error. Every lost battle is a principle of weakness and disorganization, and the first and immediate desideratum is to concentrate, and in concentration to recover order, courage, and confidence. The idea of harassing the enemy by separate corps on both flanks at the moment when he is following up his victory is a perfect anomaly. A faint-hearted pedant might be overawed by his enemy in that manner, and for such a case it may answer. But where we are not sure of this failing in our opponent, it is better let alone. If the strategic relations after a battle require that we should cover ourselves right and left by detachments, so much must be done, as from circumstances is unavoidable. But this fractioning must always be regarded as an evil, and we are seldom in a state to commence it the day after the battle itself. If Frederick the Great, after the Battle of Kolin and the raising of the siege at Prague, retreated in 3 columns, that was not done out of choice, but because the position of his forces and the necessity of covering Saxony left him no alternative. Bonaparte, after the Battle of Brienne, sent Marmont back to the Aube, whilst he himself passed the Seine and turned toward Troyes. But that this did not end in disaster was solely owing to the circumstance that the Allies, instead of pursuing, divided their forces in like manner, turning with the one part, Blücher, toward the Marne, while with the other, Schwarzenberg, from fear of being too weak, they advanced with exaggerated caution. Chapter 14. Night Fighting. The manner of conducting a combat at night, and what concerns the details of its course, is a tactical subject. We only examine it here so far as in its totality it appears as a special strategic means. Fundamentally, every night attack is only a more vehement form of surprise. Now, at the first look of the thing, such an attack appears quite preeminently advantageous, for we suppose the enemy to be taken by surprise, the assailant naturally to be prepared for everything which can happen. What an inequality! Imagination paints to itself a picture of the most complete confusion on the one side, and on the other side the assailant only occupied in reaping the fruits of his advantage. Hence the constant creation of schemes for night attacks by those who have not led them and have no responsibility seldom take place in reality. These ideal schemes are all based on the hypothesis that the assailant knows the arrangements of the defender because they have been made and announced beforehand and could not escape notice in his reconnaissances and inquiries. That, on the other hand, the measures of the assailant, being only taken at the moment of execution, cannot be known to the enemy. But the last of these is not always quite the case, and still less is the first. If we are not so near the enemy as to have him completely under our eye, as the Austrians had Frederick the Great before the Battle of Hochkirch, then all that we know of his position must always be imperfect, as it is obtained by reconnaissances, patrols, information from prisoners, and spies, sources on which no firm reliance can be placed, because intelligence thus obtained is always more or less of an old date, and the position of the enemy may have been altered in the meantime. Moreover, with the tactics and mode of encampment of former times, it was much easier than it is now to examine the position of the enemy. A line of tents is much easier to distinguish than a line of huts or a bivouac, and an encampment on a line of front, fully and irregularly drawn out, also easier than one of divisions formed in columns, the mode often used at present. We may have the ground on which a division bivouacs in that manner completely under our eye, and yet not be able to arrive at any accurate idea. But the position again is not all that we want to know. The measures which the defender may take in the course of the combat are just as important, and do not by any means consist in mere random shots. These measures also make night attacks more difficult in modern wars than formerly, because they have in these campaigns an advantage over those already taken. In our combats, the position of the defender is more temporary than definitive, and on that account the defender is better able to surprise his adversary with unexpected blows than he could formerly. Therefore, what the assailant knows of the defensive, previous to a night attack, is seldom or never sufficient to supply the want of direct observation. But the defender has on his side another small advantage as well, which is that he is more at home than the assailant on the ground which forms his position, and therefore, like the inhabitant of a room, will find his way about in the dark with more ease than a stranger. He knows better where to find each part of his force, and therefore can more readily get at it than is the case with his adversary. From this it follows that the assailant in a combat at night feels the want of his eyes just as much as the defender, and that therefore only particular reasons can make a night attack advisable. Now these reasons arise mostly in connection with subordinate parts of an army, rarely with the army itself. It follows that a night attack also, as a rule, can only take place with secondary combats, and seldom with great battles. We may attack a portion of the enemy's army with a very superior force, consequently enveloping it with a view either to take the whole, or to inflict very severe loss on it by an unequal combat, provided that other circumstances are in our favour. But such a scheme can never succeed except by a great surprise, because no fractional part of the enemy's army could engage in such an unequal combat, but would retire instead. But a surprise on an important scale, except in the rare instances in a very close country, can only be effected at night. Therefore, if we wish to gain such an advantage as this from the faulty disposition of a portion of the enemy's army, then we must make use of the night, at all events to finish the preliminary part, even if the combat itself should not open till towards daybreak. This is therefore what takes place in all the little enterprises by night against outposts and other small bodies, the main point being invariably through superior numbers, and getting round his position to engage him unexpectedly in such a disadvantageous combat that he cannot disengage himself without great loss. The larger the body attacked, the more difficult the undertaking, because a strong force has greater resources within itself to maintain the fight long enough for help to arrive. On that account, the whole of the enemy's army can never, in ordinary cases, be the object of such an attack, for although it has no assistance to expect from any quarter outside itself, still it contains within itself sufficient means of repelling attacks from several sides, particularly in our day, when everyone from the commencement is prepared for this very usual form of attack. Whether the enemy can attack us on several sides with success depends generally on conditions quite different from that of its being done unexpectedly. Without entering here into the nature of these conditions, we confine ourselves to observing that with turning an enemy, great results as well as great dangers are connected. That therefore, if we set aside special circumstances, nothing justifies it but a great superiority, just such as we should use against a fractional part of the enemy's army. But the turning and surrounding of a small fraction of the enemy, and particularly in the darkness of night, is also more practicable for this reason, that whatever we stake upon it, and however superior the force used may be, still probably it constitutes only a limited portion of our army, and we can sooner stake that than the whole on the risk of a great venture. Besides, the greater part, or perhaps the whole, serves as support and rallying point for the portion risked, which again very much diminishes the danger of the enterprise. Not only the risk, but the difficulty of execution as well confines night enterprises to small bodies. As surprise is the real essence of them, so also stealthy approach is the chief condition of execution, but this is more easily done with small bodies than with large, and for the columns of a whole army it is seldom practicable. For this reason, such enterprises are in general only directed against single outposts, and can only be feasible against greater bodies if they are without sufficient outposts, like Frederick the Great at Hochkirch. This will happen seldomer in future to armies themselves than to minor divisions. In recent times, when war has been carried on with so much more rapidity and vigour, it has, in consequence, often happened that armies have encamped very close to each other without having a very strong system of outposts, because these circumstances have generally occurred just at the crisis which precedes a great decision. But then at such times the readiness for battle on both sides is also more perfect. On the other hand, in former wars, it was a frequent practice for armies to take up camps in sight of each other, when they had no other object but that of mutually holding each other in check, consequently for a longer period. How often Frederick the Great stood for weeks so near to the Austrians that the two might have exchanged cannon shots with each other. But these practices, certainly more favourable to night attacks, have been discontinued in latter days, and armies, being now no longer, in regard to subsistence and requirements for encampment, such independent bodies complete in themselves, find it necessary to keep usually a day's march between themselves and the enemy. If we now keep in view especially the night attack of an army, it follows that sufficient motives for it can seldom occur, and that they fall under one or other of the following classes. 1. An unusual degree of carelessness or audacity, which very rarely occurs, and when it does is compensated for by a great superiority in moral force. 2. A panic in the enemy's army, or generally such a degree of superiority in moral force on our side that it is sufficient to supply the place of guidance in action. 3. Cutting through an enemy's army of superior force, which keeps us enveloped, because in this all depends on surprise, and the object of merely making a passage by force also allows a much greater concentration of forces. 4. Finally, in desperate cases, when our forces have such a disproportion to the enemy's that we see no possibility of success except through extraordinary daring. But in all these cases, there is still the condition that the enemy's army is under our eyes, and protected by no advance guard. As for the rest, most night combats are so conducted as to end with daylight, so that only the approach and the first attack are made under cover of darkness, because the assailant in that manner can better profit by the consequences of the state of confusion into which he throws his adversary, and combats of this description, which do not commence until daybreak, in which the night therefore is only made use of to approach, are not to be counted as night combats. End of chapter 14. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. On War by Carl von Clausewitz, translated by Colonel J. J. Graham.
ኦኬ አድማጮቻችን ቮሊዩም 1 ኦን ካርል ቫን ከመጀመሪያው ቻፕተር ማለት ከመጀመሪያው ቡክ ጀምሮ ኦልሞስት 4 ቡክ ነው ከቨር ያደረግነው ማለት ነው። ኢንትረስቲንግ ያው መግቢያው ላይ የሆነ እንትን ላይ እንዳስቀመጡት አክቹአሊ የላይፍ ስትራቴጂ ነው ዋር ማለት በተመሰለ ከዋር ጋር ብቻ የሚገናኝ አይደለም። ለምሳሌ እዚህ ጋር ምን ይላል? ከሌላው መጽሐፍ ላይ ያለ ኢንትሮዳክሽን ነው። Perhaps the most intriguing questions for a reader first confronted with the work of Karl von Clausewitz is what made On War so special? Why is a book of military philosophy written more than 175 years ago still so influential today? The answers are many and various, and lie partly in the difference between On War and its predecessors on the subject, and in the unique intellectual skills of Clausewitz himself. Gerhard von Scharnhorst's Handbook for Officers for Use in the Field, first published in 1793, typified the approach of previous writing on war. Scharnhorst, 1755 to 1813, the director of the Academy for Young Officers with Clausewitz attended, was a lifelong influence on the younger man. Clausewitz called him the father of my mind, open bracket, close the bracket, and held him in great esteem. Yet the difference between their two books could not have been greater. Scharnhorst's handbook stands in a clear line of manuals on the art of war in the tradition of the Roman military writer Flavius Vegetius, Iptoma Rei Militaris of the late 14th century. Flavius Vegetius, which in turn drew on many classical works subsequently forgotten in the Middle Ages. The works of Vegetius and of many subsequent authors such as Don Bernardino de Mendoza, Diego de Salazar, Marshal Lumando Montecuccoli, the Chevalier de la Villerie, the Marquis de Figueres, the Chevalier de Follard, Marshal Murcy de Sax, the Puisqueros, bracket, father and son, close bracket, King Frederick the Great of Prussia, General Henry Leod, Archduke Charles, and even the political-minded Machiavelli in his Art of War were in many ways mere cookery books. They were all divided into many chapters, sections and subsections, giving precise and unequivocal rules to follow on anything from the criteria for the appointment of a good captain to the amount of food required for each soldier, from how to conduct marches at night to how to dig temporary or more permanent trenches around compasses, from how to invest fortified places to how to attack in battle with light cavalry. As Scharnhorst's specialty was the artillery, his lectures, like his handbook, were full of geometric tables and calculations of best angles of attack and statistics about the penetrativity of missiles at particular distance or the poor quality of the British Hanoverian cannon. Other than that, he followed the vegetarian pattern religiously. Scharnhorst and all these other authors wrote with a readership of officers in mind, their manuals being devised as a course book for officers in training and as a work of reference, bracket, for use in the field, close bracket. When one grim, rainy morning the officer might wake up to see the need to cross a flooded riverbed, move camp, or launch a surprise attack on an advancing enemy, and wanted to collect his thoughts with the help of such a book to remember to make all necessary provisions and to proceed in the most sensible way. Clausewitz, by contrast, had a totally different aim when writing on war, an aim which no author before him had had in quite the same way. He did not want to write primarily about how to wage war, although On War contains some unoriginal books or chapters dealing with many of these subjects as well, book 3 to 4, see below. Instead, he wanted mainly to explore the phenomenon of war and its tangible, physical and psychological manifestations. He wanted to analyze war to understand it better. He contrasted his own aim in writing on war with that of the authors who had gone before him. Clausewitz wrote of his own theories that they were meant to educate the mind of the future commander, or more accurately, to guide him in his self-education, not to accompany him to the battlefield. Just as a wise teacher guides and stimulates a young man's intellectual development, but is careful not to lead him by the hand for the rest of his life. Close bracket. He explicitly dismissed manuals as pointless, as theoretical rules could not possibly apply to all real cases. Bracket. A positive doctrine. Close bracket. He wrote, is unattainable. Clausewitz assumed that understanding the essence, the nature of war would eventually help future leaders wage and win their wars more effectively, and this, to him, was the ultimate aim of the exercise. He has therefore been admired by strategists and leaders who sought to win wars more effectively, more decisively, and faster, regardless of whether their motives in waging war have been judged good or bad by history. The Americans, Germans, French, British, Russians, Imperial and Communist, and the Chinese under Mao studied on war in search of useful lessons, to be applied in war scene retrospectively in many different guises, as just wars or imperialist wars, wars to impose German nationalist and racist aim upon the world, war against Nazi Germany, wars of liberation, or wars of colonial expansions. For Stalin, Clausewitz was the symbol of the strategy of German fascism and was therefore dismissed as not only bad but also useless. As Stalin had defeated German fascism, for many writers of the early Cold War, Clausewitz's dictum that war was the continuation of politics by military means was inapplicable because irrational in the nuclear age, and again he was dismissed. Later on, when it became clear that the Cold War was not only characterized by the threat of war, major wars in Europe or major war elsewhere between the superpowers, but also formed the backdrop to many actual wars outside Europe, Clausewitz was resurrected and once again achieved major prominence among those who sought to learn how best to wage war. Nevertheless, his approach of studying the phenomenon of war in order better to understand it can equally serve anybody aiming to limit or even eliminate war from the world, from pacifists and peace researchers. Clausewitz himself never expressed any doubt that war was an eternal human social phenomenon. In Book 4, he wrote, "We are not interested in generals who win victories without bloodshed. The fact that slaughter is a horrifying spectacle must make us take war more seriously, but not provide an excuse for gradually blunting our swords in the name of humanity. Sooner or later, someone will come along with a sharp sword and hack off our arms." It's a useful reminder that this pessimism is gleaned from the experience of Clausewitz's own lifetime, when it was, for once, not Prussia which initiated war with France, but outside powers that brought war to Prussia. Developments since his lifetime and the further growth of international law and international organization, which are a source of hope to those who, like Kant and the fathers of the UN Charter, dream of a world in which war is outlawed and only employed by entities excluded from the community of nations could not easily be foreseen by clausewitz. This fact should not, however, detract from the usefulness of his approach to those who seek to understand war in order to overcome it. It is in Clausewitz's discussion of the human and social factors of war, not the tactical or technological ones, that one can find the greatest lasting wisdom of Clausewitz's observations and analysis, and to which we will turn below. But first, we need to consider the education and intellectual approach which led Clausewitz to achieve this Copernican leap in our thinking about war. Now, very interesting book ነው እንግዲህ እኛ ድሮ እንደ ሪኮማንዴሽን ምናነባቸው መጽሐፎች በየጊዜው እንግዲህ ለማምጣት ሞክራለሁ። መልካም ቆይታ ከሬዲዮ አብራር ጋር። ያው ሬዲዮ አብራር ዝግጅታችሁ ይቀጥላል። በሚቀጥሉ ሴግመንት እስክንገናኝ ድረስ ይዘው ተዘጋጃችሁ አብራ ነኝ። መልካም ቆይታ ከመልካም ቤተሰቦቻችሁ ጋር። ሃፒ 4th of July and እንግዲህ መልካም አትባል ይያልኩ በሚቀጥለው ዝግጅት እስክንገናኝ ድረስ ያው ለያችኋለሁ ማለት ነው።